take a lot of love to change the way things
No mai haere mai, and welcome to the Caravan of Hope. Today is Tuesday the 14th of January 2025. Happy New Year. And it's our great pleasure to be presenting here today in this brand new year, and it's our very special privilege to welcome our guest today, Peter Frost. Kia ora, Peter.
Yeah, hi, now my haere mai. Privileged to talk to you guys, thank you.
Now, I should point out that this is the second or third conversation we've had with Peter. We've previously met and had a cup of coffee together. We've had a recording which I managed to delete. So we're going to have another go. New year, new recording.
Third time lucky.
Thank you. And Kovato, how are you?
I'm very well, actually. Still very sad and frustrated that there's still an incredible genocide happening in Gaza as we speak. It doesn't seem to stop, and but we're trying to do things. We need to all make effort to try and stop it.
Okay, so as we normally do, we usually get our guests to introduce themselves because they know about themselves more than what we do. But Peter, maybe what we're going to talk about is some of your work with the UN and some projects that you've got coming up in the next wee while. But I wondered whether you could talk to us a wee bit about what your background is and what your interest is in humanitarian aid.
Well, actually, the earlier work with the UN did take me and others onto the border with Gaza, not into Gaza at the time. The journey to get there was interesting. I set out to be a junior commercial artist many years ago out of school in Wellington, and thoroughly enjoyed myself. My ambition at the time was, at the end of 40 years of work, to be a senior studio artist and earn the princely sum of £45 a year, which sounded like riches to me. I never made it, though. I ended up establishing a few businesses of my own. The time when it was possible for young men to have absurd careers. So by the time I was in my mid-20s, I'd established a number of companies in advertising, marketing and other areas. And of course, he ended up with more money than I could shake a stick at. And so, having achieved all my life's ambitions, in that time, I had a wee think. Well, I actually went farming to have a think about it. That seemed to help. So being in a farm, and shall we say a little more grounded, I set out again to try and succeed at what I was doing. The result was I ended up starting to buy land and build stuff, and thought, well, this is just a repeat of where I was in the first place. So I then went completely mad and applied for parish ministry training. And I thought they would all fall about laughing and that would be the end of that discussion and I could go back to chasing sheep and stuff. But they took it all very seriously, and so I found myself sent to Dunedin, 1977.
Where were you brought up?
I've been raised, I was born in Nelson, grew up in Nelson. It's a nice place to be. So Dunedin really felt like going back to 1953. I couldn't believe it. I thought, geez, you know. I knew I had 5 years here, and I thought, well, at the end of 5 years, I'll go back to the real world. And of course, wild horses wouldn't drag me out of Dunedin now. I'd discovered the lakes and the mountains and the university and other things here and of course came to the conclusion that Dunedin was the best city in the world to live in. And I wasn't alone in this view. We had some American friends who had come from Houston, Texas, and they'd circled the world looking for the best place to live and arrived in Dunedin and declared it to be the finest city in the world. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but why was that? The answer was that people down here do tend to think a little bit. Being Scots, and of course by now I was in the Presbyterian Church, and we were all living south of the Holy River, the Waitaki River, where everything Scottish mattered. And the Scots actually valued education, and I was beginning to learn some stuff by now, and it was fascinating me. So yeah, that's kind of the provenance, really.
So Peter, were you involved in the ministry as a priest, vicar, something or other?
Yeah, something or other. Yeah. Minister's the word. Minister. It's an odd thing to be called a reverend. I struggle a bit with that, I have to say. I do my best, but I don't think I ever quite crossed the boundary into pious. It doesn't seem to work very well. But faithful, yes, that would be true. I was fascinated by theology. I had thought when I went to Knox College that I was going to a glorified and sophisticated Bible study course that would confirm all my prejudices and Christian beliefs. It did no such thing. It challenged the very core of everything I believed. It was a massive challenge.
Yeah.
And so I listened and learned. I was very impressed with the way they taught. So here was I learning theology with the intention of becoming a parish minister, which I did. But along the way I'd also crashed into behavioural science and became very interested in the way human beings function. So with the result that the church decided to invest in me for reasons only of their own making, but in fact they continued to train me, including now more psychology and behavioural science stuff. So I went on from there into parish ministry for about 7 years, full-time, and then on into a full-time clinical practice. And so I continued the parish and ministry work, but added a full-time practice to that as well. And now I became quite busy.
Sounds like 2 jobs at once.
Well, it became absurd. I was not only doing that, so the practice had 6 staff, which was big for a psych practice. The parish had 6 churches, which was huge for a parish, of course, so you could grow old driving around it, let alone seeing everybody. And
was this a country parish around Dunedin?
well, Mangatua has centres at Outram, but also at Middlemarch, Hindon, Hyde, all around the place.
So
the long lines of communication.
Yeah.
Although it had grown massively, we had a number of Bible classes, youth groups, mainly music groups, this kind of thing. I had 50 people in worship teams, which helped.
Wow.
So that we were covering a lot of ground, but it was busy, and I was busy. And then to add to that, we started to take an interest in the international peace work.
How did that come about?
Well, what happened there was that a chap who knew me had become interested in the what was called the Middle Eastern Peace Initiative, which was funded, interestingly, by the Unification Church. And would I go to Israel for them? And I said, no, I certainly wouldn't. But they persisted, in asking, and then invited my wife to go as well, Joss, who was a nurse. In the end, they prevailed and we agreed to go.
Can I ask you why you weren't wanting to go?
Well, at that time, they were still involved in the last of the intifadas, which meant that things were pretty tense
Right.
and rather risky. Secondly, I didn't think I knew anything about it anyway, so I couldn't really see why they had taken an interest.
Why, looking back on it, why do you think they did kind of headhunt you to do that? What was it? Was it something to do with your psychology or you?
I gather people had been listening to what I'd been saying, sometimes on the preaching, but a little more than that, and that is I'd been in touch with a guy called Lee James, who was head of the Situations Department in the UN. He's a Kiwi. And he had said they will be interested in you for 4 reasons. One is you have both theology and psychology.
Right.
And overseas, theology matters far more than it does here in New Zealand. Psychology, of course, behavioural science, why do people do anything? So those 2 things in combination were of interest. And then the business experience, I knew about that and realised this could be helpful. And the 4th reason was that I was a Kiwi, and Kiwis carry very little baggage internationally because of people like David Long and others who have preceded us in this area, not to say Helen Clark, who had, of course, huge impact on UN thinking. So we were kind of intrinsically acceptable.
Right.
And so that helped. So that was kind of why the approach occurred, I think. Anyway, I went and ended up in rather a spectacular number of encounters which began to change the way I was thinking about the whole issue of where peace could occur and how and why, which led to, I think, the second part of this discussion, which is why there seems to be an impasse on peace.
So when you say you went there and you got it kind of changed what your thinking was, can you touch on what changed or what you saw that changed what your view was?
Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, there were some encounters which mattered. One of those came about because we had been taken to a rather pleasant restaurant on the Mount of Olives. Philadelphia, I think, was the name of the restaurant. It was under a grape arbor. It looked out over the old city of Jerusalem, very pleasant. And we'd been having a lovely meal there. But I'd got up and wandered out to the conveniences behind the restaurant when there was this sort of woof, and hot dust blew past me, followed by an explosion. Well, I remember sort of being slightly stunned. And they say this is what happens when an explosion occurs close to you, that you really can't credit that something has happened for a moment or 2. So I stood there, somewhat phased, I suppose, and then realised there'd been an explosion, and of course realised where I was, or what this might mean. What had actually happened is that 3 young men had died in that moment, setting off an explosion at a checkpoint, only a few hundred metres from where we were. So that was the end of the meal. We then ended up being put back on a bus and taken back to the Jerusalem Hyatt, which is where we were staying. But we were stopped at checkpoints along the way. I remember looking into the barrel of a 30mm machine gun mounted outside the bus and pointing, it seemed to me, at me. And it struck me that just a little bit of increased finger pressure on this soldier's hand would have had an interesting, fleeting outcome for me. In the meantime, another young soldier came onto the bus, this time carrying a machine gun, and looked us over, and then smiled warmly and left again. And I thought, goodness, we're not used to this in New Zealand. It struck me that this young man would be on his annual rota with the IDF, and I wouldn't have a clue whether he was a doctor or an accountant or a teacher or Christian in his normal life, but he would have been doing his required military service. Seemed rather a friendly person, given the disastrous circumstances that they were living in, of course.
Okay, so you've accepted the invitation. You've gone to the Middle East and lived and had some experiences that have changed your thinking. And I think we could all three of us say that, you know, it's only when you sometimes are in those places that you get more of an understanding than, and one of the reasons this podcast started was because, you know, we felt that what we were being told through our media didn't really represent the real situation on the ground, and I still don't think it does. So as a result of those experiences, where were you led?
Well, the result, well, yes, okay. So the situation on the ground is as horrible as you can imagine. The destruction of human beings is frightening. So that experience raised questions in my mind about who was the enemy. So some young men had died, but who were they, and why had they died? And so arguably I was supposed to see them as the enemy, but were they? Well, these were young men who were unhappy about their circumstances, and who wouldn't be, given the oppressions that we all know about there. And so in the eyes of their families, these boys would have been the young sons, the loved sons. There would also have been people being very brave, trying to attempt to recover their freedoms. And so the view of these young men, from one side, terrorists, the enemy, from the other side, heroes, and people who were precious but who were now dead. And so we couldn't realistically stay in a position of neutrality on these matters. So having begun to think along those lines, we now embarked on a trip really that took us to the Lebanese border, where we met with a Muslim community there as part of trying to dialogue a peace agreement between Lebanon and Israel. We were very welcome.
What year was this?
This was in 2006.
Okay. Which was a time when Israel had invaded Lebanon?
It had retreated from Lebanon at that point, but there was tremendous tensions. But the negotiations were beginning. And so at a ground level, we needed people to talk to one another. And so we were part of a team of people who were tasked with talking about what might be possible in terms of peace. The peace agreements, of course, what everybody's trying to achieve. And we did, and I'm enormously proud of that. But along the way, we had a little sort of feast there, and some Lebanese girls, about 10 of them, aged, I think, between about 7 and 15, danced for us this day. and they were very beautiful. And in response to their dance and their invitation, their warmth, they were very pleased to see us. A group of us from New Zealand sang Po Keri Keriana, and I thought we did reasonably well, actually, given that we hadn't trained in any way. But the sense of sharing became very real. And I think I fell in love with each and every one of these wee girls, actually. Technically, of course, they are the enemy. These are the people we kill, or should do. And it's impossible to do that, having looked into their eyes and shared with them. There's no way you want to kill these people. In fact, you want to do exactly the opposite, which is to care for them. And therein lies your first glimmer, I think, of how peace might be possible. And it doesn't lie in the peace agreements. It does lie elsewhere, I think. So a number of events followed from that.
Right.
And they're all a wee bit improbable, really. I remember sitting in the back of it was a limousine, but it was so big it was virtually a bus, talking to the Minister of Defence from Sierra Leone. And he had asked me a rather perplexing question, really, and that is, why do people sever your arm at midpoint here, rather than at the wrist or at the elbow? You can imagine trying to answer a question like that. But what I said was, if you cut a person's hand off at the wrist, then they can have a prosthesis and they can have a life. If you cut at the elbow, basically your arm is gone, it's useless now. And so you might as well forget that and get on with your life without your arm. But if you cut at midpoint, no prosthesis is successful from here, but your arm still thinks it's there and functioning. So it's an ongoing and terrible torture that never ends. So I explained this to this man. He left for Sierra Leone soon after and returned some weeks later.
And what was the context? Where were people cutting people's arms in this way or that way?
Well, I think the answer to that was that what happened next was that I was met at a breakfast in the Washington Marriott Hotel near Watergate, actually, by three people, the prime ministers for Kenya and Nigeria, and the prime minister and UN ambassador for Sierra Leone. And they were aware of the discussion I'd had with their Minister of Defence. And so they put a key question to me, which was, could I help with a discussion about and an understanding and to work with the interface between skin-deep Christianity and deep-seated tribalism in their countries? It was quite a challenging question. And so in attempting to answer that question, I realised that governments could do very, very little to influence the way people felt. Those influences had to be much more ground up than top down. And so beginning to think along those lines really led me to the understanding that I think now applies to trying to get to world peace.
I'm thinking from our previous discussion where you gave some of the reasons why peace doesn't happen, despite the kind of hot air happening about we want peace. The Americans are always going, we want peace. The Israelis are kind of saying we want peace, but at the same time continuing with warfare on both parts. Biden is, we really need peace, but he's just given $6 billion of arms to Israel. So it's kind of, the hot air is happening. Why is it that, despite the fact that most people in the world just want to live peacefully, bring up their children, have an education, you know, live just a normal life that the governments, or possibly not the governments, but other organisations have another interest, perhaps. I mean, I'm kind of answering your question I'm asking you, but...
Well, I think the question is terrifying, isn't it? So
Yeah.
how come people who appear to be of good intent actually seem so powerless, and while saying on the one hand we want peace, providing the vast billions of dollars needed to provide ordnance, which is then used primarily to kill civilian populations. And this is just a horror in itself. So why is this? And I think, can I tell another story?
Yes, please.
I had caught an aeroplane from San Francisco to Washington this day. And I was sitting in a row by myself. The aircraft didn't seem to have all that many people on, and nevertheless, a rather well-dressed man came and sat in the seat next to me, and ordered the same rather unpleasant lasagna meal I'd ordered from American Airlines. And anyway, he introduced himself, Bruce. And I said, I'm Peter. And he said, I know, Mr. Frost. And for some reason that spoiled my appetite, really. So I said, really? Yes, Mr. Frost. He said, we're interested in what you've been saying. Who is we, and what have I been saying? Was my reply to that.
Right.
He said, well, can I come back to that? We would like to talk to you in Washington, if we can, about the way that you are describing the difficulties in achieving peace. And by now I was quite perplexed, really, because back in New Zealand, we were trying to establish a peace school somewhere in New Zealand, and my intention was that it would be at Otago University. The primary funders were from Auckland, wanted it in Auckland. So I'd spent some time trying to get their millions into Dunedin, and for some reason succeeded in doing this. So we now have our peace school established here. But I was aware that the Americans had established a number of peace schools of their own. And a problem was that it appeared that almost all of those peace schools were CIA funded.
Right.
And that was a worrying aspect. And so, of course, I was quite concerned that this man sitting next to me in the aircraft might have been CIA, and curious about why I was saying the things I was saying. And so I waited for him to explain who he was. And the answer when it came was that he was from Congress. And this startled me, of course. But what they wanted to talk about was my saying that governments are effectively powerless in these matters. But what I had been saying was, as a result of talking with various prime ministers, and again, something quite curious had occurred there, and that is that they had used me to moderate meetings of groups of nations. So I'd end up in, say, Seoul in Korea or something like that, sitting in these were very beautiful rooms with chandeliers, everything you can imagine, with groups of prime ministers, 10 or 12 of them in the same room. It was my job to moderate the discussions on how they, as a group of nations, would achieve peace within their area. These were interesting discussions, as you can imagine. And while they were very interesting, they were effectively futile. And the reason became clear because after the discussions, when maybe we were sitting having coffee in a restaurant or something like that, the Prime Ministers would quietly, one at a time, come and sit and talk. Well, what they said was, we would love to implement the kind of peace discussions that we're having here, but we dare not. And the reason is that if we suggest, even to our colleagues, let alone our nation, that we should disarm, our population will react so unhappily to this that we'll be thrown out of office at the next election, if not unseated from leadership of our party before that. Well, what will occur is that whoever is in opposition, you can imagine this in New Zealand, so New Zealand's loyal opposition would, when any government proposed disarmament process or something similar, simply say that we will increase our defence spending and maintain our forces at a greater level. In other words, fear-driven. But it's not just the governments, it's we ourselves. If we actually were faced with these sorts of options, most New Zealanders would vote in favour of military continuation, calling it defence. The tragedy is that no military activity can actually lead to peace. It can only lead to war.
So,
I was also remembering that, as well as the, let's say, the reaction coming from the country, there was also what's happening with what you call trans multinational corporations, who are also had a very big vested interest in not having peace around the world.
Well, this is what I was saying to the man from Congress, and that is that you are effectively powerless. You are not the defenders of democracy, you are the maintainers of conflict. And of course they weren't very happy with this idea, but had to accept that that was simply true. I had gone quite a bit further, and that was to say that they were using their resources not to defend nations, but in fact calling it investment, ending up being exploiters of nations, and had come involved in their own deception, which was leading to increased conflict, not a reduction of conflict at all.
is there an idea here that, you know, that it's almost capital neutral, you know, to fund a war, because you know if once the war finishes you're going to have to fund the rebuild, and that it's almost like, you know, that there's no real benefit to stopping a war other than just changing track and providing different resources.
Yes, exactly. So Kowado's very important question here is who are these vast organisations that provide the funds effectively for everything? And the answer is that we still call these organisations banks, but that's too small a name for what they really are. We're talking about huge transnationals with vast monetary resources. So JP Morgan Chase would be an example of this. And that bank, if we call it that, is worth $3.7 trillion. That's New Zealand. So you could put that in proportion. New Zealand's gross revenue, something like 455 billion. That means that this bank is worth something like 14 times New Zealand's economy. So its buying power, resourcing power is immense. And it isn't the biggest one. The biggest of these is the Chinese commercial bank, worth 6.3 trillion. If you can imagine, that's 630 billion. So in effect, staggering amounts of money. Well, a curious phenomenon occurs here, and that is that these organisations are, of course, transnational and multinational, so they have branches and operations throughout the world. And what that then means, that if one part of the world is in conflict and war with another part of the world, these organisations are banking in both places. So that if this happens to be the losing side and this happens to be the winning side, there's of no concern to the bank. But they're hedged against losses on the one side by the gains on the other. Anyway, at the end of the energetic process, that is the process whereby you go about killing people, you finally get to the end of that, you then have to rebuild. And of course, guess where the funds come from?
With interest.
So now, these organisations can never lose. They're funding the war, they're funding the losers, and they're funding the rebuild. So there's nothing but gain for them. Well, this doesn't mean that they're actively promoting war. What it means is they're disinterested. They have nothing to lose from war.
Why cut off the supply of business?
Consequently, if they're malign in any way, they're virtually untouchable, and you can actually see that in New Zealand. So New Zealand every now and again gets a Standard & Poor's rating to tell us whether we can borrow at whatever levels. This organisation will tell us what our average salary level should be, what our tax levels should be, what our interest rates should be, which is of course interesting. What's more interesting is that we never see these people, we never vote for them, we never vote against them, and yet they are setting and determining some of the most important elements of our own economy and our own lives. We have absolutely no influence over them, and so the idea that New Zealand is somehow a sovereign state becomes absurd. We aren't.
So Peter, given that the governments are kind of a bit ham-tied, is that the word?
Hamstrung.
Hamstrung. And the bigger organisations like Chase Manhattan or the Chinese bank are disinterested because war is a profitable activity. What can we as individuals do? What would you propose?
Well, I think, it's such a big question, that, isn't it? So you've got fear and impeding process on the one hand and indifference on the other. Where do you go with this? Well, the answer is curiously self-evident, and that is that you can't rely on your government or any organisation to get you there, which of course means that you've got to go back to your own initiatives to achieve any change here. So for a long time now, we've had what are called neoliberal economics, and this has been promoted to us as a way of preventing war. If you can think of a way in which it's prevented war, you're doing better than me, because I simply can't see it. We seem to have had endless, constant, repeated war, and there seem to be lulls along the way, but we'll go back to the same problem before very long, and end up prosecuting war or adventuring war somewhere, somehow, at shocking cost to the people involved. So nothing seems to have really been successfully achieved here at all. So going back to that point, we can't rely on organisations or governments to get us there. Therefore, we're going to have to learn how to do this ourselves. To do that, we're going to have to be motivated to believe that it's actually possible to take action on your own initiative. Now, here in New Zealand, we're faced with the fact that we're paying for the most expensive food in the world, bar none. We're at the top of all costs for any country, any nation, anywhere, and yet we produce some of the cheapest food in the world. So something's badly wrong here. Well, what can we do about this?
And we also export 80% of our food. It's not like we're short of food.
No, in fact, it strikes me that there's so much profit coming from our food sales that probably these organisations could supply us with free food and still make money. But anyway, that's not happening.
No.
So we end up paying these absurd prices.
we're paying more for food here than if you buy New Zealand food in England.
Or Australia, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is clearly a nonsense. So what are Kiwis going to do about that? Well, I suggest there is a simple answer, and that is to just simply boycott the main supermarkets. Simply let's introduce a supermarket free day, or set a day, and just not buy. You can go anywhere else you like. Go to a farmer's market, go to a night and day store, go somewhere that's not part of the main food chain, buy your food there. It's not...
Or grow more of your own.
Have your own garden. I love my garden. It pleases me to be able to produce food, but of course it reminds me that I'm paying too much for the stuff anyway.
So what would be the result of that? What would be the implication if 1/7 of the supermarket's weekly takings disappeared?
Or were significantly reduced?
What signal would that send?
Well, there's a small signal to the supermarket saying, hey, look, we're a bit irritated by this. The main signal is to ourselves. And that is that we can withdraw from buying at rates that are absurd if we really want to. So if it has no impact on the supermarkets and they continue to exploit us at this appalling rate, then we go to a supermarket-free week, which of course would have an impact. We'd have to plan for this. But a signal of that kind would signal not only to New Zealanders that we're tired of this unfair, unreasonable treatment, but more importantly, it signals to not just New Zealanders but to the rest of the world that it's possible to withdraw from things that we don't want. And that's where we get our first glimmer of what might be possible with regard to world peace.
And I'm just thinking, you were telling us that there was an example in the 80s when Scotland, something happened there where food prices were exorbitant.
Yes, it's interesting. So one of the reasons I'm aware of this is because a chap here working for the Salvation Army at the time had gone to Scotland and studied the economic issues that were affecting food there. And what he found was that the Scots were fed up with paying too much for food and many other things, and had started to create their own informal, sometimes called black economy. And what they had done was set up their own supply systems, and so you were able to go to what had once been an industrial site, a warehouse of some kind. Everybody who was willing to supply food at reasonable prices other than a supermarket was supplying food there, and so you go and buy it. They were growing food wherever they could, and they were supporting one another in doing so. And so they had withdrawn their buying from the supermarkets. This very effective process wasn't promoted around the world. One has to wonder why.
I would say it was discreetly covered over by as many supermarkets as possible.
Yeah. Well, what it showed was that with a little bit of intention, people could have a powerful influence on organisations that appear to be very powerful and very difficult to manage. And of course, the most powerful organisations are the military ones, the ones who decide that we're going to claim things which are ridiculous. For example, the conflict between Israel and Palestine is absurd. These people all stem from the same source, so you can go back to here your theology becomes useful. You can go back to the Abrahamic tradition and find that Abraham was the father of both Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac, therefore, becomes the father of Israel, and Ishmael becomes the father of all Muslim people, effectively. And these people are now in conflict. And this is absurd. We're really talking about the same family. same concerns, same interests, same needs, so that you get the strangest of options occurring. And I think a very good example is where Mr. Netanyahu is. So here's a man who is yet another national leader who is a criminal, charged with, convicted for behaviour that is disgraceful. And yet, by being Prime Minister or the leader of the nation, he's immune from prosecution. So it is very much in his interest to remain in power. One of the best ways to remain in power is to create a war.
Yeah.
Because everybody then has to focus on this diversion, which is such a tragedy for everybody involved in it, and yet the individual promoting it remains immune. This is a catastrophe. So withdrawing our support for the process becomes critical, but you of course are not allowed to do that. Your own policing and military forces say that you must participate, and you can pick off people and make them do so simply by threatening them. So basically running the system on fear.
Yeah.
If, however, sufficient people decide that simply aren't going to participate in that anymore, that is, we're going to withdraw from supporting a military process, then it becomes impossible for a government to actually control that. And that is because sheer numbers overwhelm these options. So we saw a glimmer of that in Japan just very recently, where Prime Minister Yoon decided to control a situation he was unhappy with martial law.
In Korea, I think.
Sorry, in Korea.
Yeah, there's a classic example, isn't it?
And so, of course, they put a police force in place to maintain this, and the people in the streets simply ignored that, made it possible for the legislators to ignore the police and the armed military and walk back into their legislature and vote this man out and retake control of their own circumstances. This is a wonderful piece of democracy.
Yeah.
Well, that's what democracy is in the end. You know, it's. I remember studying this in classics. The University of Otago. We've been told that the conflict, I think, who was it, with the Persians at the time. So the people of Greece had to go and fight off these nasty invaders. And so there were two types. There were the nobles with their horses and the helots, the farmers. And so the nobles rode into war, the helots trudged along beside them, carrying their picks and whatever else they were going to use. And off we went to war. And the Persians had come along with a particularly nasty weapon called a bow and arrow. And these weapons were wonderful for shooting people at a distance, and the best targets of all were the people on horses, the nobles. And so they very quickly decided to get off their horses and walk alongside with the helots. And so, shoulder to shoulder, you could beat the Persians. And so that's what happened. Then they went back to went back to Greece, back to Athens, of course. And the nobles hopped back on their horses and set about governing the country again. The helots were a bit irritated and said, look, if we're going to fight shoulder to shoulder, we're going to govern shoulder to shoulder as well. And this was the first demos, or demonstration, from which we get democracy.
Okay.
Here is the idea that, in fact, sufficient people say, hang on, we're not entirely happy with this. In fact, all of these choices need to be shared. Whether we're going to go to war or not is something that you and I will discuss amongst ourselves, not being led by those people who have a vested interest or a monetary interest in the outcome, but instead an interest in surviving and staying alive, and even more importantly, an interest in caring for those other people, the people I'm supposed to hate, I'm supposed to kill, are not people I want to kill at all. Human beings like I am, and all you've got to do is meet them to very quickly decide you don't want to kill this person at all. And so a choice of that kind becomes very empowering.
I heard something on the thing, this is coming back to what's happening with Israel and Palestine, and they said at the moment, and this is largely through social media, which we have to thank for that, they said if you went back 30 years, most of the Jews demonstrating against the war in between Israel and Palestine, or Israel and Gaza, they were trying to raise money for the Israeli cause. They said now most Jews who are in the States demonstrating are demonstrating against Israel. They're demonstrating for peace.
I think we're becoming tired of it. What we can see is that a few individuals manipulate this option to their own advantage, and that isn't going to suit us. So we go back to the wee girls on the Lebanon border. The youngest of those would now be 27 years old if she's alive. If any of them.
Because they've just all been bombed once again by Israel.
Who knows? But suddenly it becomes very personal. I don't want them to be hurt.
Yeah, that's right. Because we have to kind of realise, well, we're all human beings.
So if we think about some of the work you've been doing, I know you've got an event coming up in March, which is asking the question, is peace actually possible? And we're called the Caravan of Hope for a reason, because we're hopeful that humanity will come to its senses in various parts and think more closely about who is my neighbour and how can I coexist and live in a peaceful place. Can you tell us what is coming up for you and what you're hoping to achieve?
Well, I think I was sobered up by the experiences around the world, which basically told me that what appeared to be the powerful organisations were either not powerful at all and couldn't achieve things for us, or they were disinterested and didn't need to bother about it, which left us with an option, and that is, do we care enough about the possibility of actually offering peace to others sufficiently to achieve this? Well, this is again, it's kind of biblical. So there's a story early in the Gospels in the Bible about this guy, Jesus Christ, going off into the desert and being tempted by Satan. But one of the temptations is to join with Satan, or the satanic figure, to bring about peace. You and I together can create peace. So this is peace by force. We'll overwhelm everybody, therefore we'll have peace. The kind of Pax Romanus or Pax Internationalis in which somehow a controlling influence brings peace. And Jesus Christ says, no, get behind me, I'm not interested. If you want peace, then you take it, you deliver it, you give it to the person next to you. And so if we do that, that is, we actually offer peace to other people instead of saying, you're frightening us, we're going to therefore shoot you, cross the border instead. So if you can imagine this, it's a little hard to imagine, but the day that Hamas attacked Israel, killing people in a dreadful way, was a moment of choice for Israel. So at that point, they armed themselves and then in due course invaded Gaza with the catastrophe that continues there today. They didn't have to do that. They could have put their weapons down, picked up their food supplies and walked across the border and said to everybody in Gaza, how can we help? What can we do for you? We didn't have to have a war at all. Mr. Netanyahu would have been thrown in jail by now, but there would have been peace in Israel. We could do exactly the same on the West Bank, moving into a highly conflicted area and providing the resources, the care and the concern that actually seems to come naturally to human beings once they lose their fear. And so it lies there in that kind of answer. It's a choice to be made, and it only has to be made by sufficient people to become massively empowering.
Yeah, and I mean, what is amazing is I read about some chap whose name I've forgotten, but his parents were peace activists, were killed in that raid by Hamas. He was Jewish, and he is still talking about and campaigning for peace. You know, and he's Jewish, Israeli Jewish man. I forgot what his name is. I think he started a youth hostel or something in Bethlehem.
Yes.
Which was open to everybody.
We've discussed that with someone. I can't remember who it was.
One of the other impediments is outlined by Danny Frickberg, who's an expat Jew who was conscripted into the IDF, as was compulsory for anybody in Israel, and there found that the treatment of Palestinians was so appalling that he withdrew on conscientious grounds and came to New Zealand and entered the Peace School, which I'm thrilled about, of course. And there studied the difficulty. What he looked at was how many soldiers withdraw from the conflict. What he found was that almost all of them would like to. In reality, when they attempt to do this, they suddenly find themselves more and more isolated. So if you start with, say, 50 soldiers, and all of them agree that this is a bad idea, having conflict, so what will we do? So 40 of them say, well, okay, we'll protest about this. 30 of them actually do so. Of those 30, 20 have some continued effect in insisting on it, but slowly it whittles down. And in the end, it's 0.3% of those people who actually do withdraw. In other words, tiny numbers. And what has happened is they've begun to look around and fear that they're alone, that the other soldiers aren't with them anymore, they're no longer protected. Human beings hate being alone.
And you also get your family and yourself get persecuted in that you don't get the jobs, you don't get, you're ignored. It's not just you, it's your family. I know an Israeli woman here who said, I went into the IDF because if I hadn't done my military service, my family would have suffered.
Yes, so here come the manipulations. So in effect, unless you've got agreement across an entire society, you're going to be ineffective. If you don't have an agreement across an entire society, then you're doomed to recurrent war. So you want to make a choice about this. Do I want to participate in, be affected by war? Because you can be quite sure under contemporary military processes that you, the citizen, will be the target.
I mean, I was thinking one good kind of thing that's happened was in the recent United States election, even though it's a kind of strange outcome, was that a large proportion of Democrats didn't vote for the Democrats, and these were mainly young ones through social media, because they were pro-peace, and they actually didn't go for the Democrats because what's her name, the candidate? Kamala Harris actually didn't go, actually we're going to do something. They are actually continuing with she made no promise to actually do anything. And so they actually withdrew their vote. And in fact, some of them voted for Trump because Trump said something like, well, I'm going to bring peace to the world, which we have yet to see whether there's any substance to that. There's usually not much substance to what he says, but hopefully, I hope that he does bring some peace, some meaningful peace.
How nice that would be.
Yeah.
The tragedy is our own fear. But we can be frightened very easily. Look, somebody wants to shoot you, we must shoot back. The reality, if we stop being afraid and do the opposite, so we deliver the care, we deliver the bread, we deliver the compassion, we deliver the peace, and if we do this in sufficient numbers, then that's completely unstoppable. And so it's a choice. Human beings always have a choice. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn hits him, you said, it's not the governments, it's not the politics, it's not the religion, it's none of those things. It's the choice made in each person's heart that decides whether there will be a conflict or not. He was right.
And there we go. That's probably a good place for us to stop today. Peter Frost, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, and we wish you all the very best with your upcoming event in March.
Which is, what day is it in March?
8th of March.
The 8th of March in Dunedin.
In Dunedin, arguably at the university, but we'll advise on a venue when we know.
We'll put that up when you know a more definite location.
And hopefully we'll be able to answer some of the questions that you raise in that event. But from me, Brent Caldwell, may you be well, may you be happy, may you live with ease.
And from me, COVID-omatic, may all beings be at peace.
Well done, you guys, for trying to achieve and maintain this critically important discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's gonna take a lot of love to change the way things are. It's gonna take a lot of